Thank you very much for coming here, both in person and online. My name is Dr. Işılay Gürsu. I'm the Assistant Director here at the British Institute at Ankara. And I'm very pleased that we are hosting this event this evening with Dr. Muhammed Toptaş. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, first of all, I would like to introduce the BIA a little bit, because this is the first cultural heritage lecture of this year. Although we are in March, this is the first one. And we are going to have many more. And as you may all know, BIA is a charity institution, and we are very dependent on our supporters and donors. So we would very much appreciate if you consider becoming a member. And if you want to get more information about how to become a member of the BIA, you can also check out the QR code that's available on the screen. And for those joining online, please feel free to raise all your questions during the lecture in the Q&A section. And if you have any problems about the connection, voice, anything, please let us know through the chat. And please let us know where you are. So we will be happy to hear from you in the chat. So now it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Muhammed Toptaş, who's a lecturer currently at Hacı Bayram Veli University here in Ankara. And he completed his PhD in Museum, Gallery and Heritage Studies at Newcastle University, a program that we are also collaborating here at the BIA. And his research examined how Scandinavian national museums engage with questions of decolonization. So his work explored narratives of Nordic exceptionalism and investigated how museum displays both reinforce and challenge perceptions of colonial entanglements. Drawing on post-colonial and decolonial theory, Dr. Toptaş's research looks at how museums contribute to shaping national identity and how they participate in the broader process of decolonizing knowledge. His current research interests lie at the intersection of museum studies, memory studies, and decolonial theory, with a particular focus on the politics of representation, colonial legacies, and the role of museums in shaping collective memory. When you publish your first book, we will certainly make sure that we have a copy at the BIA's library. Yes. So we are very much looking forward to that. So this is like an encouragement, no pressure, but encouragement. But in the meantime, if you're interested in similar topics, I encourage you to visit our library on the second floor, which is an excellent collection on heritage and museum studies. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Toptaş to deliver his lecture entitled, so this is an important point for me. Let's see, Colonial, Complicity, Exceptionalism, and Decoloniality. An examination of Scandinavian National Museums display. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Işılay Gürsu and British Institute for accepting me to give a lecture here. As an early career researcher, this kind of opportunities sometimes finding this kind of opportunities sometimes quite challenging. And I would also like to thank to my dear friend, Dr. Batuhan Özdemir, for creating some sort of networking opportunities for me as well, because as an introvert person, this kind of interactions can also be quite challenging. Today, I'm going to talk something outside of the BIA scope. I know that BIA usually focuses on Anatolia, Northern Black Sea region, and occasionally Mediterranean Sea, but today we are going to talk about the up north Europe, specifically Scandinavia. And this is my research that I successfully defended a year and 5 days ago. And now today I'm here to just give a speech. So a title, as you guys can see, as seen like a colonial complicity, exceptionalism, and decoloniality. So in this research, in this speech, actually, I will first try to explain what is Scandinavia, what do we understand when we talk about Scandinavia, and what is their colonial complicity, and then try to understand what is exceptionalism, specifically Nordic exceptionalism, and then we will continue to post-colonial, decoloniality, what are the differences, and then we will look into the case studies. So in this research, my research question was, do the key Scandinavian national museums, and in this regard, National Museum of Denmark, Gothenburg Museum of World Culture, and Oslo Museum of Cultural History, acknowledge their different and shared colonial histories, and to what extent decolonizing practices affect their permanent display? So, like, first of all, as I said, I will try to define Scandinavia. So, because especially in Turkish, when we talk Nordic countries translated into Turkish or Scandinavia translated into Turkish, it's both same. We say Scandinavia, which is Scandinavia in Turkish. And because of that, understanding the difference sometimes can be a bit difficult. Scandinavia actually defines a location. Today is in Norway and Sweden area. It's like a plateau and only consists of Norway and Sweden. But due to long-standing historical connection, Denmark is also considered as Scandinavian. But when we are talking about Nordic countries, we consider all the countries that we've seen in the slide, like Greenland, Faroe Islands, Iceland, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. So there is this kind of difference. And in this research, in order to narrow the context, I just wanted to focus on Scandinavia only. And the Scandinavian countries offer an interesting case study in colonial history. Similar to other European countries, they were motivated by economic gain. During the 17th and 18th centuries, both Sweden and the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, tried to colonize territories in the West Indies, Africa, Asia, and North Atlantic. In this regard, Denmark was the seventh largest slave trader with 111,000 enslaved people on 450 ships between the 1660s to early 1800s. And Norway led in the number of missionaries sent relatives to its population. So they played quite a role. However, despite playing such significant roles in colonization, these countries in the shadow of more powerful empires and did not develop a sense of being colonizers both globally and within their own countries' populations. So from this perspective, like, understanding the colonialism is quite important, because as you guys can see, like, the first definition is just a straightforward, what do we understand with the colonialism? But in this research, when I look at the colonialism, I try to understand it's like a more complicated phenomena. Like, it involves political, ideological, cultural, and economic control, the creation of beliefs of race and differences, and taking right to conquer and subjugate, taking and using another group's material culture, as well as dominating, imposing upon, and exploiting other groups by a more dominant group. So it is more complicated, in-depth phenomena. Okay. So in this regard, if we look at these countries' history a little bit, so the first thing that we see, all these three countries had like some sort of union from the late of 1970 till the 1523. So all three countries were under the same banner, which is called Kalmar Union. And then Sweden decided to leave. They just left. But Norway said, you know what, I'm happy with my situation. I will continue with the Denmark. And they had like a long-standing union with Denmark. But inside of this union, after the establishment of absolutism in 1661, the control of the union shifted to the Denmark. The Copenhagen become more prominent inside of the union, and the union was finished in 1814 after the Napoleonic War. Norway ceded, but since the Sweden was in the winning side, they just asked the whole Norway as a compensation, and they just annexed the whole Norway. So Norway is just kind of like a little bit in between. One time, there was a union with the Denmark, and then it just becomes a part of the Sweden. And at the end of it, in 1905, Norway managed to get their independency. But in terms of colonial activities, specifically Denmark-Norway colonial theories can be scrutinized under two subheadings. The first one is North Atlantic ones. These are the territories first were invaded by Vikings. But after the Norway's union with the Denmark, they become a part of Denmark as well. So these are Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. And some of them are still part of the Danish Commonwealth, Faroe Islands and Greenland. And the tropical colonies were literally this colonial, the results of these colonial actions, like during the 17th and 18th century, Denmark tried to colonize some territories in Danish West Indies, St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix Islands, and in Danish India, Tranquebar, Serampore, and Nicobar, and in Africa, the Gold Coast, Ghana. So they try to colonize these territories and manage to it. But when we look at Norway, the colonial history of Norway is a little bit hard to understand, because Norway is kind of in between situation. It's like some sort of liminal situation. For some, it is a colonized territory. For some, it's a colonial, active colonial country. Because we know that they had like a union with the Denmark. It's a long, approximately 400 years of union with Denmark, but the Copenhagen, the Danish culture permeated in the establishment residents in the towns of Norway, as well as the members of bureaucracy. So they, step by step, they started to take the control of Norway, and they're just playing a crucial role inside of the Norway higher bureaucracy. After the Napoleonic Wars, Sweden come to the rule, and they become a part of the Sweden for 100 years. So in this regard, it seems Norway is a little bit colonized territory against the other Denmark and Swedish countries, Sweden. So in this perspective, like accepted by a couple of historians, it was the Norwegian Danish was a Danish colony, or on the verge of becoming a Swedish colony. And in their historiography after the 1905, this viewpoint became a significant facet of historical interpretation, and has been emphasized in education till 1960s. So most Norwegians still maintain a national identity, not as perpetrators of imperialism, but as imperialism victims. But what is the reality? Yes, they seem like they look like they were colonized, but in reality, they played a huge role in missionary activities. And one of the leading figure in the colonization of Greenland, for example, the Hanseged, was originally Norwegian. Or Norway has sent more missionaries out proportionally than any other nation in colonial history. So in that regard, they played their role in a different way, like by just sending missionaries. And they didn't send missionaries only to the Danish, Denmark, Norway kingdom territories, but also other empires' territories as well, specifically Congo. So, and that kind of colonial attitude, not only limited into the missionary activities as well, because in their territory, in Norway, today's Norway, in the north part of Norway, there are a couple of indigenous communities, Sami societies, Kwen societies, Gypsies, and they did a couple of activities against those communities as well. One of them, the most crucial one, was against the Sami society, specifically from 1850 till 1959, and they did a Norwegianization against the Sami and Kwen societies through the educational programs, extra taxations, and Christianizations. So they tried to make them, according to Norwegians' perspective, more civilized human beings. So, and when they do not accept those kind of attitudes, they were just always a punishment against those communities. But when we look at the other countries, Sweden, like talking about the colonial history of Sweden is relatively straightforward, because they didn't do much, but still they tried to be part of the colonial actions. Similar to Norway, they did so-called civilization actions against the Sami society. They did like education programs and taxations because those territory were enriched with the silver resources. So they tried to civilize them. But other than that territory, they also tried to colonize some territories outside of Sweden. And one of them is in Delaware, USA. They called it New Sweden. One in Africa, Fort Calusburg, and Caribbean islands, Saint Bartholomew. But all these are short-lived, not that successful attempts. And when they realize that they cannot be a good colonizer or effective colonizer, they started to use their industry. Gothenburg, one of the biggest city of Sweden, become a trade center, and they started to use their industry to help the other big empires, the British Empire, French Empire. They started to take the iron from them and process it and then sell them back. So in this regard, they tried to be part of the colonial trade and networking. Oopsie. All right. Okay. So as I mentioned, these countries always become in the shadow of other powerful empires and did not develop a sense of being a colonizer idea. So this could be attributed into two factors. The first one is the consideration that Scandinavian countries and Scandinavian colonization was small and insignificant compared to other European empires. The second is rooted in a phenomenon called Nordic exceptionalism. This term defines the Nordic countries' peripheral position in European colonial history, as well as how both themselves and others perceive these regions as different from the rest of Europe. This exceptionalism is further underscored by their strong institutions, reliable welfare benefits, low corruption, and effective democracy. For example, these countries consistently rank among the top 10 in the world for happiness. And in population level surveys, Nordic citizens also report that they experience a high level of autonomy, freedom, and social trust, which significantly contributes to their overall life satisfaction. Therefore, such an exceptionalist idea makes it relatively unusual for Scandinavia and colonialism to be used in the same context, insofar as it contradicts the ideal imagery of Nordic lands that is characterized by unspoiled nature, simplicity, social egalitarianism, Protestant ethics, and democratic culture, and with ancient roots. So, however, this does not change the fact that the participation of these countries, like as I mentioned, Norway was the 7th largest slave trader country. So, in this regard, I thought that like looking at these countries quite a significant, but we need to look at from a theoretical framework that I obtained, decoloniality. So decoloniality is a concept developed by Latin American thinkers, and they also considering the post-colonial studies as well. The concept itself builds on coloniality, which Anibal Cuenos defines as the persistent power dynamics that resulted from colonialism and shaped social, political, and economic systems long after official colonial government ceased. So it is something that lives on right now. Coloniality emphasizes the close ties between colonialism and modernity. It sustains hierarchies of race, knowledge, and labor on a global scale. While coloniality focuses on the systems and structures that continue to shape global relations and knowledge production systems born out of colonialism, decoloniality highlights the importance of examining and dismantling them. So according to Argentinian philosopher and semiotic Walter de Mignolo, this can only be achieved through delinking from epistemic and aesthetic hegemony. Mignolo even goes for one step further and advocates not so much for the aesthetic, but rather aesthesis, that is an ontological reconfiguration of senses and perceptions that is shaped by coloniality. So they're just saying that we need an epistemological and ontological reconfiguration. We need to delink ourselves first and then reconfigure again. But how are we going to reconfigure? By integrating the other's knowledge into the knowledge production. Yep. So in this regard, museums are playing quite a huge role, because museum study is one of the key institutions to be examined, both epistemologically and ontological aspects. Identifying the epistemological dimension of museum is relatively straightforward. As I mentioned here, there are places where knowledge is constructed. However, considering a museum for an ontological perspective involves contemplating the elements that define them as such. or the system that allowed them to create knowledge, create knowledge, such as serving as spaces for preserving, displaying, and interpreting cultural, historical, and artistic artifacts. It also includes understanding the museum's mission as well as their practical contribution and the role of museum staff, regardless of their position. So, but when we talk about decolonization and museums, we see these couple of steps. First of all, like identification the colonial traces. What are the traces of the collection? Or is there any like a problematic objects? Let's repatriate them or not. Or how are we going to mitigate with the situation? Or sometimes collaborating with indigenous communities. This is especially important when it comes to the knowledge production, because in order to understand every object, they need to some outer perspectives as well. So include them. Or artist initiatives to just create some new ways of seeing and understanding the world. And these kind of approaches are quite crucial if museums try to decolonize themselves. So from this perspective, I started to analyze the museums by utilizing the display analysis methods. Display analysis method, just looking at the museums, the exhibition itself, what is given to the visitor. So you're just looking at the museum or specific exhibition as a visitor. You can only understand the given text, the juxtaposition of objects, and then their connection between them or within the building or environment, everything. So in this regard, the first museum, if we try to do some sort of like a little analysis, my first museum was the National Museum of Denmark. It was established in 1892. And specifically, I analyzed one exhibition, Voices from the Colonies. And this exhibition was opened in 2017. The main idea of the exhibition is just telling the colonial history of Denmark. And it was opened in 2017, 100 years of, like a century of the selling the last final colonial territory of Danish kingdom to the USA, the Virgin Islands. So they're just trying to do like, okay, it's been 100 years, let's talk about it kind of movement. So the museum is big. When I visited, there was like 12 or 13 different exhibitions in that museum, 4th, 5th floor, and the location of the exhibition specifically. So if I don't know whether I have a mouse here. All right. Okay. So imagine this is the entry, and we are the second floor, and we need to go all the way here, till this corner, or opposite way, all the way this way and reaching this corner. So that is the location of the exhibition, which is important because if you're talking about your colonial history, and if you're willingly to acknowledge that history and share with the community, maybe you can just try to put somewhere that easily accessed. But no, let's put it on the corner. Okay. Like to me, I was literally looking for that exhibition. It took me 20 minutes because I got distracted with other objects, but it happens. Anyway, when you first enter the exhibition, you see a big world map. There are like a little red dots. Every dot indicates one of the Danish colony territory. And there are like some extra labeling beneath them. And it was given like information about those territories. In that regard, good, acknowledging the territories, good. But when we are looking at one of the label, so this label specifically for Iceland and Faroe Island, and it starts like Iceland and Faroe Islands never have the studies of colonies. Okay, so how? And because that is a bit problematic approach. Because and the text itself continues. The King of Denmark has exerted stringent control over trade through monopolies. So in the text itself, there's some sort of contradiction. So you're just controlling the trade, but at the same time, they are not colonies. So Iceland's status is a bit problematic as well. Some argue that Iceland was not a colony, but a unique part of the Danish territory with a distinct characteristics. And conversely, others contend that Iceland exhibited colonial traits. Those who supported the latter view acknowledge that while certain elements of colonialism were present in Iceland, others were not. In that regard, we can look at the political, economical, and cultural perspective. So in terms of political, yes, Iceland was not a colony because they had their own home rule within the Danish Commonwealth. But in terms of economic, we just see, like the text itself says, there's a control of the king. And in terms of cultural, that thing becomes more interesting because there was a distinct perception of Icelanders, Faroese, and Greenlanders within Denmark at that time. So, and they were attributing them to the nexus between colonialism and racism. So, this idea comes from the Lars Jensen, one of the key guy for Nordic exceptionalism idea. He argues that the racialization of Inuit of Greenland establishes their legitimacy as colonial subjects due to their non-white and non-European racial characteristics. And this allows the Danes to assert their superiority over them. The situation differs for the Faroese and Icelanders. A questionable whiteness has led to them being regarded as lost white tribes. This characteristic characterizes Icelandic and Faroese people as pure and isolated, which fosters cultural relations with Danes while simultaneously portraying and othering them as insufficiently modernized within the European metropolitan culture framework. So they're just doing, you guys are our ancestor, and we do care about your culture. We love you guys, but your ancestor, you're old-minded. You're not as civilized as we are. So they just control the Iceland territory by looking at this perspective. And in this regard, they control the territory and colonize the territory. But the label itself says never have the status of colonies. When you move on in the exhibition, in the next room, you enter a room that talks about the Greenland, and there's like a one TV on the wall, and it loops 3 different testimonies. These testimonies were coming from colonized individuals, subjects. One from the Greenland, a lady who were taken when she was 3 years old and bringing back to Copenhagen. And in Copenhagen, she spent 18 months. And then after 18 months, they sent her back to Greenland. So she says her testimony is quite striking. And she says, like, we got closer and closer, and I grabbed my suitcase. And that's when I saw my mother and siblings. And when the gangway was attached, I ran down to my mother into her arms. I hugged her, then started to tell about everything I'd experienced, but she doesn't answer. I look up at her. Why doesn't she answer? Then she said something to me, and I look up at her. I didn't understand what she was saying. We didn't speak the same language anymore. So that was one of the colonial actions that was conducted by Denmark. They specifically for Greenlanders, they were just taking the people from Greenland, take them back to the Copenhagen, so-called educate them, and then send them back to the Greenland. But when they do that, people were losing their language. They were not communicate. And even in some cases, for women, they were trying to, how can I say? They were trying to, I don't know the English word. Yes, they were doing something bad as well. Like I'm sorry, I just didn't the word didn't come to my mind yet. But in that regard, the museum itself showing this dark history inside of its exhibition. So like imagine that you're a Danish citizen, you're just entering this room and see such a horrorful history. So it's kind of like a striking, and it is good for decolonial approach because you acknowledge your colonial history. But when you again move on, you come up with another room. So yeah, in this room, we have 2 displays in front and Danish flag on the background. So the displays itself, like the one on the left is it has objects from the West Indies, and on the right has objects from the Greenland. And the main content of the room and the main theme of the room is about identity. So the one on the left has a couple of cultural clothing and everything. Actually, both of them has the cultural clothing. But on the left, there is also like a DNA test because according to the museum label, the people in the West Indies are trying to identify their ancestors. And in order to do that, they're just using lots of DNA tests. So it talks about their identity and identity seeking process. And on the right side, it talks about the Greenland, but again, the Greenland's identity and their position within the European Union and how they become criticized by the European Union and how Denmark was defending them against the European Union in many occasions. But the text, along with it, the text continues in a little bit interesting way as well, because it kind of compares two different territories. Both of them were Danish colonial territories, but on the left one, the West Indies was sold to United States 100 years ago, like more than 100 years ago. But it was talking about they do not have a representation right within the US Parliament. They cannot represent themselves. They do not have any voice in that country. But on the contrary, on the right side, it was saying that the Greenland, or the people of Greenland, they have right to talk. They can talk in the Danish Parliament, and they can express their thoughts, so they have voices. So in this regard, it kind of like it gives the idea of kind of support the exceptionalist idea as well, because on the left one, they're gone, but the right one, Greenland, is still the Danish Commonwealth. It's part of the Danish Commonwealth, and it says that if you still were part of me, you would have probably like a voice in Danish Parliament. But now, since you're gone, bye-bye, in US Parliament, you have no voice. You cannot represent yourself. So in this way, it's kind of like it compared them within the exhibition. But the semiotically, the challenging thing is there is a big Danish flag on the background. So these are like a transparent displays. And when you're looking at it, you just see two displays talking about identity, and on the background, it's a big Danish flag. And flag, if you like, probably you guys heard of it, banal nationalism, Michael Billig. It's the key nationalism object. So when you see a flag, you should feel it's some sort of identity. And it just kind of gives the idea that even if you are West Indies or Greenlandic, the Danish role is always up front. Like we were there, and that specific Danish flag was the flag that they were lowered when they sold the Virgin Islands. So in that regard, all in all, this museum itself, they acknowledge their colonial history perfectly. They just give some hard truth, but at the same time, they continue to exceptionalist narrative, because it kind of gives that, oh, the Scandinavian or Denmark was doing something good. We played a good role in your life by saying, yeah, like we just give you like a political autonomy for Iceland, or we just create your identity. So it's kind of like some sort of dilemma here. In the second case study, we will look at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. The museum itself was opened in 1902. And the exhibition that I analyzed in this museum was The Control: Attempting to Tame the World. And this exhibition was opened in 2022. So the main idea of the main narrative of this exhibition was the human and animal relationships. How do we control the animals? How do we tame the world and controlling the animals? But when they're talking about controlling the animals, they're of course controlling the peoples as well. And in that regard, they kind of connect with the colonialism as well. So in this regard, compared to the previous museum, this one has like a big room, and inside of the big room, there are 5 different themes. And in this presentation, I will focus on only 2 of the themes here. But before focusing on the specific themes, I would like to talk about aesthetic preferences of this exhibition a little bit. Some of you will know that in museum sector, there are a couple of approaches in designing the exhibitions. And one of them is called the white cube approach. Especially it is used in the contemporary art galleries. And they are known with their minimalist design, white walls, wooden floor, and controlled ceiling lighting. These features are intentionally utilized to create neutral, unbiased, pure environment that emphasizes the display of artwork. So in a way, like abstract the environment and highlight the objects. This is the main idea. But the origin of this white cube is also a little bit problematic as well, because it can be traced back to the ideological clash that stems from the initial implementation of this approach, especially early example, it was in Museum of Modern Art in 1929, and subsequently with approval of Hitler at the Haus der Kunst in Munich in 1937, the first architectural endeavor was undertaken by the Nazi regime following their ascent of power. So from this perspective, like white cube use represents a demonstration of power dynamics at play within the art world. So it perpetuates the notion that artwork must adhere to a certain standard, specifically that of modernity, in order to be displayed in such manner. So if you want to display an art object, you have to have white walls, wooden floor, ceiling, lighting, and these kind of things. And this reinforces exclusive and restrictive norms that favor a select few within a hierarchy. Such an approach is at odds with the idea of creating a neutral space of art. So in that regard, this exhibition is not a white cube. I call it white cubesque because yes, on the right, we see like a wooden floor, but on the left, we don't see the wooden floor. But we can see like intentional white walls and white objects and white display cases. And of course, the ceiling lighting. This is important because when we look at the displays, it becomes more important. So the first display that I analyzed, the forms of use and interaction. So in this display case, there are 135 objects or group of objects from 13, 14 different countries: India, Indonesia, Congo, Kenya, Madagascar. And the display itself does not provide any information about the objects. It just says knife from Russia, bowl from Ethiopia. Because if you give this amount of objects in one display, you cannot explain all of them. But rather, they decided to explain none of them. They just give the basic description of them. But when you do that, the essence of the object sometimes is gone. And this kind of approach is a kind of like an obsolete approach that we see in ethnographical collections. So for an exhibition that was opened 4 or 5 years ago, this kind of approach is a little bit odd. And when you lose the essence of the objects, I mean, is influenced by the beliefs, experiences, and perception of the individuals or groups who possessed it. And with this kind of representation, you cannot get those ideas. You just see the objects only for their purposes, and they cannot move outside of their purposes. You cannot catch their artistic values or any more details. And when you move to another section, actually this section is the only place that talks about the Norwegian colonial actions or the display. They changed their approach. They put 38 objects within the 9 display cases, and some of the objects are just by themselves. On the left side of this photo, because of on the left side, it talks about the Sami territory and how they colonized the Sami territory. And on the right side, they talk about their missionary activities. And in that regard, the museum itself talks about their colonial history, acknowledging them and trying to make things better. Yes, in terms of creating knowledge, they do a good job. But when we look at the artistic approach, it becomes problematic. But first, I will just give a focus on one specific object, because this object is a perfect example of how decoloniality can be implemented inside of the museum environment. So this object, Vietjere, when they first acquired, they had little knowledge about it, of its identity, and they just enter being labeled as the shaft of the meat knife. And then they decided, actually, this should be wrong, right? And they decided to change it to runbom, which is a Sami shamanic drum. And with the increasing decolonial thinking and ideas, they eventually decided to ask a Sami shaman to define the objects, to include their knowledge production, to include their knowledge into the production process. And eventually they understand that this is neither a shaft of a meat knife nor a shamanic drum. It's a drum hammer. So this what decoloniality wanted. And in that regard, this exhibition, specific to this object, they did a really good job. Like they're just trying to identify the real meaning and create the knowledge accordingly. But when it comes to the aesthetic approach, they kind of like did a little bit wrong in this regard, because they were trying to make things look like an artwork, And in this regard, it looks like an artwork because the object itself displayed inside of the one display case, so it gives an importance to object. But when we look at the previous ones, 135 different objects, they don't care anything about those objects. So it kind of contradicts inside of it. It just we understand some of the objects as an artwork, the others they're just not that much. And this is kind of like a problematic approach because, as I said, who decides what is art or not? And if you try to do in this kind of perspective. So the aesthetical approach of this exhibition kind of continues the colonial perspective in a way. So, and the last case study is Museum of World Culture in Gothenburg. It was opened in 2004. I just realized that I wrote the Gothenburg in Turkish. I'm so sorry for that. And I analyzed the Crossroads exhibition in this museum. The exhibition itself opened in 2016, and the exhibition's main narrative is about the cultures and how those cultures intersect with each other and how we can live with the global and different cultures in the same environment, how we can live in that kind of intersection point. Okay. I identify a couple of themes inside of the exhibition. Like one of them is the control, the other one is the beginning of colonialism, adaptation, colonial mindset, and Oriental. And in that regard, this exhibition's approach a bit different than the other two examples. The first section that you come up, it talks about something contemporary, the scarce of water. Every one of us problem, and it is kind of connected with the modernity and then that the destroying the world. It is connected with our lives, and the museum does that by just putting a boat and life jackets from Syrian refugees, by just giving that, even if it's like a historical thing, it still affects our lives. It just kind of it manages it connect what is historical, it is not historical, it still affects our lives. In that regard, it shows the coloniality. So colonialism is not over, it still continues to shape our lives. And in that regard, it just manages to show it. And in terms of aesthetic approach, it tried to challenge the aesthetical approach understandings as well. For example, when they're talking about the waters, it just puts lots of water vessels from different cultures, but inside of the display case, it puts something more contemporary, something that you can easily recognize, like a baby water bottle or milk bottle. So when you see it, you see a different water vessels. You don't need to know what are they or which community that they were belong, but you do understand their connection with like a contemporary object. So it kind of highlights how the ongoing global issues affects our lives as well. But it doesn't stop there, and it continues to the more historical eras as well. And in this section, Pachacuti section, it talks about the Iberian colonialism. And when it comes to the colonial histories or colonial research, the early colonial expeditions are always ignored. In academy, in museums, we see lots of 17th and 18th century focus, especially the British Empire, French Empire, or even in a more contemporary base, like American colonialism or Israel settler colonialism. These kind of things we see a lot, but we do not see much work on the beginning, the Spaniards and how did they colonize the Latin America. So in that regard, the museum tries to look at the source, the beginning, and it in this session, similar to the Norway, it shows one of the key object called kipu. This is kind of like a long forgotten tradition. The Mayan people were using these ropes and knotting them, and when they trying to understanding the word by the shape of the note. So there it is just like a book, and that tradition is now long gone and it is destroyed by the colonial actions. So in this way, the museum shows that the beginning is important, but at the same time, it had the similar approaches, similar destruction at that time as well. And it continues, not like it doesn't stop there, and it starts talking about the Swedish colonial involvement as well. In this section, the Kanga section, it focuses on the Africa, where the Swedish missionaries worked excessively. And inside of this section, it talks about all the missionary activities, their wrongdoings, and try to acknowledge this history and challenge them. But while doing that, aesthetically, it accepts a different approach as well. So Dikanga is a word from the Congolese cosmology. It defines the world, the living world and the spiritual world. But in terms of artistic perspective, aesthetic perspective, they created a sphere that the visitor can enter inside of it. But when you enter inside of this sphere, you become a part of the Kanga, that cosmology. The floor is like a shiny, reflective floor, and the objects, the people who walk inside of it reflect, and it kind of gives the idea that, okay, this is the spiritual world, because according to Congolese cosmology, this is how they were seen. So it kind of provides some sort of opportunity to understand different aesthetical approaches inside of the museum environment as well. So from this perspective, when we try to conclude, all three countries can be said to have adopted a relatively effective approach to acknowledging their colonial histories. However, this acknowledgement does not entirely embody a decolonial perspective. In this context, it becomes evident that notions of Nordic exceptionalism are particularly entrenched in Danish case study. Conversely, Norway has made some progress in critically examining its own history. However, it still tends to reinforce a colonial aesthetic when constructing its narrative. All in all, among the case studies, Museum of World Culture in Sweden stands out as the only institution that has effectively implemented a decolonial approach and openly challenged the Nordic exceptionalism. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this fantastic lecture.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations. Do we have any questions from the room? If not, I would like to start.
Okay. Yeah.
Break the ice. It's an interesting topic, as you underlined at the beginning. It's also interesting, like, given your identity, to work on this subject. I was curious about how this topic is now perceived when you're back to Turkish academia here. Like, how do people react to your PhD topic? What kind of?
I struggle. People do not understand what I did, first of all, like, because as a Turkish academic, they expect you to do something related to Turkey, or somehow connected. And when I'm talking about decolonization or exceptionalism, it becomes more difficult to talk as well, because there's an understanding that, like, there is no colonial history in these lands in Turkey. We cannot talk about colonialism at all, like even in an Ottoman Empire, which to a certain degree, yes, it is true. Like, we cannot consider Ottoman Empire as a Western colonial actions, but there is always like subjugation throughout the history. So we cannot deny the subjugation, but we cannot also perceive it as a Western colonialism. And when I say decolonization or decoloniality, this term is quite new to Turkey yet, and this is what I struggle, and especially the Scandinavia is just interesting. Like, I received this question there actually quite a lot, and not here. And as a why do you study Scandinavia? Like, you came to England, to Newcastle, and you're just studying Scandinavia as a Turkish. Like, what's the point? And the key motive for me was, in Turkey we have a different perspective, like not a different perspective. We have we accept this exceptionist perspective of Nordic countries without questioning them. And I wasn't thinking that anything bad about any Scandinavian countries before I went there. I'm not still thinking anything bad, but I cannot connect anything with the colonialism and Scandinavia. No, it is impossible. They are the a welfare, everything, like beautiful environment, and it becomes more interesting. But as a Turkish, the Turkish Republic is a kind of historical sense, it's a decolonized country, like all the independence movement and the republic. It's like a decolonization, but in a historical sense, not in this decoloniality sense. But that understanding is not implemented inside of our mindset as a Turkish people. So while I was doing this research, I just kind of like enlightened, oh yeah, like I'm also like a decolonized, like I'm a member of the nation decolonized themselves from a colonial empires, even though it was a super short time compared to other nations. But yeah, like these kind of problems always I come up with, and I don't know, it just kind of, I feel like it gives like a different perspective because you're just looking at these countries from like a higher, not higher, like you just put them in a higher position and then you're just trying to identify them. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether this is the answer of your question, but yeah.
Have you talked to any museum professionals
Oh
working
yeah,
in
yeah,
this?
yeah. Oh yeah. Like I said display analysis, but I also did the semi-structured interviews in this research, and I talked to the curators and the curatorial team managers of each exhibitions.
So they were the ones who were questioning like why you were studying this subject?
They were, and also like colleagues in the UK, my supervisors, for example, or other people in academy. That was actually the first question I always received. Why do you do Scandinavia? Where does it come from? So yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, this talk is about three very specific exhibitions in three large-scale museums.
Yeah.
What about the general public? I saw that the Norway statue of the big person who was colonizing and everything was very much had quite a lot of red on it. So how does the general public look at its past? And then there was somebody that was a statue that was going into the water. Is that the way it's generally perceived, or is this also, I mean, museums are not maybe not for the whole public, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. In terms of public perception, it's quite controversial right now, especially in Denmark. The exhibition itself was the result of the movement, social movement in Copenhagen. They started to look at their colonial history and they wanted to understand it. And as a result of that activist movement, the museum decided to create this exhibition specifically. Initially, they were planning to do something that only focuses on West Indies, one of the colonial territories, and then they decided to, instead of the one territory, let's look at all of them. But still in Danish understanding, the acceptance rate is quite low. There is an increasing number, but it's still relatively low. This photo specifically, the statue itself from Greenland, and from Greenlandic perspective, of course, they just don't like Hans again, and they just don't want neither Danish nor American control in their own lands. So they want to be independent. And actually, in 2024, it was the 500 years of subjugation, and they were hoping to get their independence, but still it didn't work. They have home rule, and they are kind of both happy and unhappy because they're happy. There's a huge money comes from the Danish government to help their infrastructure, but at the same time they remember all the history and they just wanted to deny it and they want to get rid of it. But inside of the Denmark, still the acknowledgement is not that high. In Norway, it is quite high. Like everyone is accepted. They did lots of missionary activities and they did lots of bad things against the Sami society. And they're right now trying to make everything better, especially for Sami people. For the other territories, they just kind of accepted it, but they do not much. But for Sami, that is in another story. They're just actively trying to understand them. For Sweden, since they have like a little history, the acknowledgement is also so little as well. So lots of people don't know that they colonized a territory in the US. So New Sweden is kind of like a mystery for them. But they started to accept it as well, thanks to the Museum of World Culture, because the main purpose of that museum and the opening of that museum is kind of accept the differences in their culture and trying to boost and bolster the Swedishness inside of the country. So it says like wherever you come from, when you contribute to the Swedishness, you're fine with us. So they're just trying to accept in this way. But when it comes to colonial history, it is not that much. Yeah.
I think we
Yes.
okay. We have one question.
I don't think I ever heard about Sami people before. Could you just say briefly who they are or what they are?
Oh yeah. So Sami people, they are living in the up north, Norway, Sweden, a bit Finland and Russia. They have like their territory, and that territory is called Sapmi. From Swedish perspective, they call it Lapland, but that word is a derogatory term because Lap has like a bad meaning, and they just don't want to use it. But still, in Sweden, they use it as Lapland to describe the territory. So they live in the up north, and since they live in the up north, their main custom is reindeer herding. So they care about the reindeers. Their whole life is about the reindeers and everything. And right now, because of the increasing touristic activities, they started to do activities like living a life in the North Pole kind of activities, and tourism becomes their one of the key activities as well. But for a long time, they've been living up north. They were reindeer herder, and like they are the only indigenous society that was accepted by the European Union of the Europe, specifically for Europe. So they are well known within the Europe. If you just if you are in Norway or Sweden, but when you come outside of that territory, Sami word can be mixed with all the Turkish, the Sami legend or Sami society kind of things, but they do not have any connection with what we see Samis here and there. So they're just like a kind of similar to Inuit people in Greenland.
Like the Eskimos.
Oh yeah, kind of like Inuit people, and but they are not living in the Greenland. Instead, they live in up north Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, part of Russia. So yeah.
We have one question.
Teşekkür ederiz hocam. Kusura bakmayın tekrar.
No problem.
Thank you. A wonderful talk. My question is similar to Işılay's. What work has been done on Ottoman colonialism? The first part of your talk had so many echoes of Ottoman history. What must be done to bring greater awareness in Turkey of the colonial aspects of its history?
By me, none. I did nothing about the Ottoman colonialism. I did nothing. But in terms of if they wanted to see to understand Ottoman and their colonial actions, maybe they can read Emrah Safa Gürkan. He talks a lot about the historical connection and how you cannot conceive the Ottoman empires within the Western colonialism because Ottoman Empire failed to catch the mercantilist activities, and they failed to invent big ships to colonize the new lands or reinvent the new world kind of things. But that is not my expertise. I'm sorry.
There's one more,
Right.
if you have time. One. Right. Thank you for this amazing talk. You showed so well how exceptionalism eclipses confronting, acknowledging colonial histories in museums. I wonder if you see this impacting how the museum presents challenges of the future, like climate change.
I mean, in Museum of World Culture in Gothenburg, they mainly talk about the future. They're just trying to understand the contemporary issues as well. But in both Denmark and Norway, that was quite limited. Actually, in Norway, it was talking about the future, but as I mentioned, the exhibition itself was talking about the relationship between the human and animals, and it was talking about how animal herdings will be in the future kind of talk. So in that regard, from a colonial perspective or how the future will shape, it doesn't tell much. But the global issues like water scarcity or climate change, only the Museum of World Culture in Gothenburg talks a lot, especially in that water section. That was one of the main key ideas. But other than that, in other two museums, I didn't see that kind of topic at all. In other exhibitions within those museums as well. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for this
Thank you.
amazing talk. And for those of you who are in the room, I would like to invite you for a small reception here. So if you have any further questions, you have the chance to continue our chat with our speaker. And for those of you online, please follow us. There will be another lecture at the end of April, and we will be advertising about that on our social media channels as well. Thank you so much for coming.